All right, hello and welcome. My name is Elijah Carey. I'm with National Instruments, but I'm joined today by several guests who are avid LabVIEW users. And I'm excited for today's topic. We're going to be talking about how to do team-based development with LabVIEW and just calling upon these guys' experiences, lessons learned, their tooling. And we'll get into that here in a second. But I do want to give all these guys the opportunity to properly introduce themselves, and we'll get into their background with team-based development and LabVIEW. So, Sam, why don't you go first?
Yeah, my name is Sam Taggart. I've been using LabVIEW since 2007. I started working at Westinghouse, and that's a lot of my team-based development experience was there. I worked on a team of about maybe 10 developers distributed over several different locations. Then at some point, I quit and moved to Colorado and did some consulting and worked with a bunch of smaller teams. And now I'm working with a team based in India that has maybe 20 developers or so.
Okay, awesome. And then Casey.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me, Eli. Uh, I'm a partner. My name is Casey. I'm a partner at Zaya Solutions, but previously I worked at a large system integrator. I started using LabVIEW around 2006, so I guess I got a year on Sam. So believe what I say and not him.
There you go.
I'm a LabVIEW champion, CLA, CLED. After I worked at that system integrator, I was on my own for a while. I was just a solo consultant, and at Zaya Solutions, we're a small team of 4, but we work with both small and large teams. So I've kind of had experience with all different types of workflows as it regards to source code control and seeing a lot of different things there. So happy to talk.
Nice. And Jörg?
Yeah, also thanks for having me, Eli. I'm happy to be back on. My name is Jörg. I'm an Austrian. I have been living in Germany for more than 15 years now. I've been writing software for a living for more than 20 years, so I'm dating myself, I guess. I'm saying this so that I can get more years than Sam and Casey, but I also started with LabVIEW in 27, same as you, Sam. I was I guess a freelancer or solopreneur, whatever you call it, for a few years, and around 2015, 2016, I started building out my own brand, my own company. And we're a LabVIEW consultancy. We work with customers who do LabVIEW development or software development themselves. And we're 8 right now. And same as Casey said, we're working with different customers, small ones, big ones, mostly or oftentimes integrating with their teams and trying to help them make their lives easier. So that's our main goal.
So, sorry, who won? Who started first, and what year was it?
Casey.
2006, right?
2006.
Both by a year.
So 2006 was the year I started at NI. So that would have been my first experience with LabVIEW as well. And as you guys know, but just for the audience, I actually got my CLA, so I'm an architect as well. And throughout my, what is it now, about 18 years at NI, I spent a lot of that time interacting with people like yourselves and our customers. And I got to say, this topic is one of those that is the most common and recurring time. Of all the engagements I've had with our accounts on architecture and best practices and scalability, just the simple activities around team-based development, I shouldn't say simple, but just the seemingly simple activities around how I share code and how I collaborate on code, I think are one of the most recurring topics. And I think part of this is that the state of the art has continued to evolve, tool chains have evolved, but of course, LabVIEW is somewhat unique. So let's actually start there. I want to come back to tools and best practices and collaboration and communication, but let's start with the elephant of the room. LabVIEW is a graphical language. And a lot of the tools that people use for team-based development are not really built around graphical code. In fact, they're built for text-based code. And so I guess what is the most important thing that you would say any new or aspiring LabVIEW programmer needs to know about how to do team-based development and the unique challenges that go along with the fact that it's graphical? Like, what's the number one thing you want to impart to somebody that's exploring LabVIEW for the first time and thinking about this topic, thinking about source code control, thinking about collaboration? Yeah, Sam, go ahead.
I will go. I would say the thing I would try to impart is, yes, it's different, but it's still software engineering and all the best software engineering practices still apply. You do have to jump through some hoops in order to make things work with LabVIEW. But I mean, I get people to say, oh, you can't do source code control with LabVIEW. Yeah, you absolutely can. So you should still be doing those best practices. And if you have trouble, reach out to the community. There's a great community of people out there who are willing to help you and point you in the right direction.
Okay, so all the same best practices still apply. I guess, Casey, Jorg, anything else you would add as far as things you want to make sure somebody knows, just because it's LabVIEW, like, what do I need to know in terms of being successful when it comes to team-based development? Casey, I guess I'll pick on you first.
Sure. I think the biggest difference, as Sam kind of alluded to, is still source code control. And the only difference is that the files are binary, right? They're not text that you're dealing with. So your biggest pain points as compared to a text-based language are probably going to come around diffing and merging, right? Those files. So this isn't so much a very beginner thing, but I do think that a lot of the pains and issues can be avoided if you organize your code well, so that you're not stepping on each other's toes. So you have your code modularized so that one person is working on something. If you have a multi-developer team, another person can be working on something else without worrying about touching each other's code, and because that can lead to problems, like I said, with diffing and merging.
Makes sense. Jorg, how about you?
I'd take a step back actually and say that the first thing that is good to understand and know is how LabVIEW is being both marketed and targeted. It's usually like maybe in a lab environment, most probably used by engineers who probably did not study computer science. So when you are getting serious with LabVIEW and wants to develop more than the occasional VI in the lab, I think it's important to understand and to lobby for the fact that it is software development that you need to do. So it's not enough to, I don't know, to get the manual of LabVIEW and sit down, and only because it ran in the lab, it will then run 24/7 in production environment. So on the management side, understanding that engineers might need a little bit of training, might need resources, might time, maybe external consulting to build up their applications. That's not really specific to LabVIEW being graphical, but rather to LabVIEW being what it is and what it's great at. And sometimes I think the expectation that you get from, or used to get from the marketing material, etc., sets people up for a difficult path because they don't get all the resources they need to do proper software development. And that's before you actually touch the tools and the technology.
So let me follow up with a point related to, I think, how LabVIEW is marketed, and I'll assert its appeal to people that are not computer scientists, not software engineers by trade, a lot of mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. At what point does something like source code control become relevant, right? Like, when does the work that they're doing in LabVIEW, what's the threshold or the criteria at which point it's like, aha, now you need to do this? And how would you describe that transition, Jorg?
I think once, I mean, it's a blurry border, or like it's a transition probably. But once you start to reuse or share code, it's probably the point where you start really benefiting from source code control. So either it's more than one person doing the job or more than one project that you're working on, when there's I think a tangible, maybe even measurable advantage of taking the overhead of using source code control, because on first glance, it's an overhead, right? You do more than you need, but it pays off later.
Sam?
But I add a yes, and so that is all great. And I do agree with you. As soon as you start working with another person, that definitely changes the dynamics. But I think about it as, if you walked in tomorrow and your computer was gone and that code was gone, would you be okay with rewriting it? If you're okay with that, then fine, you don't need source code control. But if you're not okay with that, then you should have source code control.
Just to play devil's advocate, I think a lot of people would say, I mean, you know, I personally use iCloud. It backs up my hard drive to the cloud. It's not source code control, but if my laptop were gone, I can go to another machine and get my source. So why do I even need source code control? Isn't that enough?
I think that's a very interesting question, actually, because I've had that conversation recently with some people. And I think part of it is source code control is kind of like a solved problem, right? So the solutions are there and they exist. And Google Drive, yes, it has all those old versions, but it's the same problem with all the zip files, right? You don't know what's what. It's hard to track changes, and Git, particularly SVN, also has this like very rigorous way of tracking changes. And also like the ability to do diffs is actually really big. I know I've talked to certain people, Darren in particular, who doesn't actually use the LV merge tool or the LV diff tool, LV compare. I use it all the time. So I find it really useful to be able to pull up two versions of things side by side and look at like what changed. And with the you know, Apple Cloud backup or whatever, that's not easy to do.
You're saying Darren Nattinger doesn't use LV merge?
He and I had a conversation about this, and his thing was basically like, you know, he just goes and reviews it with the developer, and the developer shows them what they changed and stuff, and he's not as big a fan of it. Because I forget where we had that conversation. Hopefully, I'm not putting him on the spot. If I am, I'm sorry, Darren. I don't know. I thought that was public knowledge. If it's not, maybe we could ask Darren and cut that part out if it's not.
No, it's fine. And here's in the spirit of other information that's not necessarily public knowledge. I'll share with you all.
I will quickly go on record and say that I rarely use it.
Okay,
So,
well,
really?
if you're willing to prove my counterpoint, that's good. Okay. I mean,
no, I don't want to prove a counterpoint. I'm just saying I rarely use it. So
yeah. No.
That's
Now, I think I was going to say we acknowledge there's room for improvement in the tool, and we're making improvements to those tools that will be coming out soon. So I think what's interesting to discuss is it because the tool isn't providing as useful an analysis as it ideally would, and therefore you're not invested in using the tool, and then we can talk about the improvements? Or is it because that if you're doing really sophisticated collaboration, you actually kind of avoid the need for it, especially the need to merge code? I don't know if either of those resonate more with you as far as why you don't use it, Jorg.
So I can only speak for myself and maybe a few people that I know in my little bubble. But both things I think are spot on, Eli. The one thing is I'm a very pragmatic person. And if something doesn't work well, then I try to find other ways to get the job done. And what you said sounds very familiar. So we're trying to work very modular so that we don't need to compare resources all the time. Specifically, merging is not allowed in our way of working. So we do not merge VIs, we only merge branches. That's a design decision, I guess. So yeah.
That's a really important point, something I've heard. So I just want to echo that. It's that within the landscape of your project, you still do merging, right? Like, and I think we'll talk about how we structure and arrange that later on. It's just, you know, what is the cohesive or atomic boundary at which you are merging? And what you just said is it's not at the VI level. So somehow you're defining other sandboxes or bounding boxes that you're actually doing the merge operation on and avoiding the collisions at the VI level, right?
Yes.
Okay, Casey, I know you want to get on this too. So what are your thoughts on the utility of those tools?
I think part of it is the overhead, or at least the perceived overhead as well, of getting it working with some of the external source code control tools. Like if you're using Git, how you set up LV compare or something like that to do your diffs. And it's not versus like a text-based language, a lot of that is built in, right? You can just see it right there. Like if you ever commit a LabVIEW project file, which is largely HTML or XML rather, right? You can kind of see side by side what the changes are, but not so much with VIs. So just that between different clients, it's a little bit different in how you might set up the National Instruments tools, the NI tools. So I think that causes a little bit of friction as well. I also wanted to go back a little bit to what we were talking about before as far as when you should use source code control. And I take the stance that I think you should pretty much always be using source code control if you're developing code. I mean, I think Fab, who we all know, says everybody needs a personal time machine, right? And I certainly treat it like that. Maybe this is because I started with a larger company working with a team, but when I was a solo consultant, there were oftentimes I was working on projects that was just me, and I still used source code control all the time, right? I want to have the option to, if I have a release, go back and make a fix to that without interfering with some of the features that I'm working on currently. So I think it's really valuable for that sense.
That's honestly the answer I was kind of expecting from you guys. I think that we tend to cater to the I'm not a programmer, but you know what? I'll assert too that I think the daily workflows of people doing non-programming activities has evolved, right? Remember, like it used to be I'd write a Word document and then it was _V2, _V3, final, right? And I think with rare exception, most of us have evolved to relying on the configuration management that's built into tools like Office 365, because sitting around disparate copies of documents is obviously problematic. And the same is equally true of software development, more so, really. But now I think it's a little bit more expected. Anyway, I think
and honestly,
Sam,
there is some
yeah.
One last thing. There is some overhead with the tools that are used, but it's not that much anymore. I mean, they're kind of a mature thing, right? And it's not hard to get spun up. There's a large community of people out there that'll do it, that'll help you, and you can get it going in 5 or 10 minutes, and you don't have to worry about naming things .v2 and the date and where I put that zip file and that stuff anymore.
Please let me quickly vindicate myself. Eli, you were asking when would you convince somebody that he should switch to source code control. I totally agree with Casey. You should always use source code control for software development, no matter what. But I already benefited from doing that. I already know why I'm doing it. But when you're talking to people who don't do it yet, I think you need some kind of reason. So that's what I was talking to, just to make sure.
That makes sense.
No,
that makes sense.
Good. Yeah. For me, the reason is if you lost it, would you care? And if it's code that you like, sometimes I write simple demo code like for a blog post, and sometimes I don't bother putting. Although often I do put it in Git just for the ease of sharing. I think is something that Git's really good at, right? You can create a GitHub account, create a Git repository locally, and push it and share it with the world in a few seconds. So,
another strong reason to give is traceability. So we are currently working with a customer who uses Git just so they can prove to their end customers which version of whatever they used for running certain experiments, which is not LabVIEW, but the same thing stands really. So now they're using Git on the machines. So that was I guess the most straightforward thing to do to have that traceability. So that's another good reason, I think.
Makes sense. Sam, you had another comment?
Yeah. I want to go back to the LV compare discussion. So Casey made a comment about ease of use and setting it up. And yes, it is a pain to set up. It's gotten better over the years. But if you go to my website blog, I can throw a link somewhere. But I have an article, and basically you just copy and paste a few lines into Git Bash, and it sets it up for you. So like there really is no excuse not to have it set up. But as far as like reasons to not use it, noise is a big one. And I hear that's gotten better. So I do a lot of my reuse code in LabVIEW 2020, which is a whole other topic to talk about when working in teams, and maybe we'll hit on that later. But I do my reuse code in 2020, and that version of LV Compare does not have all the checkboxes to turn off all the cosmetic stuff. But I do think that is a spot. And the other parts of that too is sometimes your changes affect multiple files. Like I am changing, I do error handling in this project. So I'm adding some error handling stuff here and there, or I'm adding some logging. And it affects multiple files, and you can only really view 2 files at a time. So it's kind of hard to get an overall picture of what's going on. That is one spot where I think I know NI is interested in some AI stuff. I think it'd be really interesting to have an AI that would look at a set of changes and say, here's a summary. They added logging to these 3 modules, right? And then you can go and look at the details and see all the individual logging calls and stuff. But it would just give you like that context. Sometimes you get that from the commit message. And if you're working in teams, definitely try to do good commit messages. There's some standard notations out there you can look at or something, but come up with don't just put change the file. Okay, great, wonderful. Like, especially with LabVIEW, like with text files, sometimes I'll be like updated the README. Okay, they can look at the diff and see that I added a line about XYZ. But like for LabVIEW files, if you do that, like they have no clue. So anyway, I'll let somebody else talk now.
No, that's a good point to take away, is that I think because of the nature of LabVIEW, like the commit text becomes that much more important. And like this weekend, when I couldn't get Git to work at first, it was because I didn't realize like the commit comment was required, or I couldn't hit submit. So I think a lot of the tool vendors recognize the value of that too. Anyway, Casey.
Yeah, so just continuing the LabVIEW compare discussion, I think it is easy to set up the tool itself, but there also still is, the tool is set up, but the way that the LabVIEW IDE functions, right? It's not just take this file from one version, take this file from another version, and easily compare them, right? And a lot of times you got to load the whole context of the project. If they're a member of classes or libraries, that has to be loaded. So making sure then, like when Git or whatever client you're using, how it does those different branches and names them also, so that you can compare them when there's proper linking and dependencies are also all properly defined. That can be a challenge as well. So there's
a trick where you pass it the VIs to compare, the first one that you want to give it is the one that's already in memory, so the dependencies aren't. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna assume your best practices document covers that, and we can send people to it.
Yeah, that is definitely a trick that I learned because I was wondering why I was reloading everything multiple times.
Yeah.
I figured that out.
So I think there's a lot of, so we've spent a lot of time on the merge and diff tools, and you know, when it comes to tooling in particular, I do want to have you guys each tell us what tools you're actively using right now. But then I want to shift the dialogue away from tools, although we can still talk about them, and more into like how you design for team-based development, how you organize your code, how you communicate with your teams, et cetera. But let's really make sure we hit the nail on the head with regards to tooling. So York, tell us like what your preferred tools are that you're using right now, mainly for configuration management, source code control. Any other relevant tools though, for the sake of collaboration?
So we are Git users. Anywhere we can pick our own system or use our own system, it's Git. And we ourselves are hosting our own GitLab server. So that's one of the web-based management platforms that you can use to manage and look at your repositories. You can have your Git repositories just on disk, or you can have them in a server, which makes it easier with user management, for example, overall maintenance, and also all of the different providers have different tooling on top of just repository management. Everybody knows GitHub, and many people know GitLab, and then there's the whole Atlassian toolchain, etc. So in the recent years, they have all caught up to each other, I think. So like 5 or 10 years ago, there was a huge difference in which tool you pick. Nowadays, if you look at the differences, it's hard to even find out what's different. Of course, I mean, GitHub has a focus maybe on something and GitLab on another thing, but I feel like in the last 2-3 years, it became less important which specific provider you pick. Also in regards to CI, which I understood we're going to talk about later, last 2-3 years, all of them came up with their own fairly nice to use CI machinery. Also, they function quite comparatively, I think, so they are very similar to configure. So we are using Git and GitLab for the,
As far as, I mean, between GitHub and GitLab, I gather those are like the two most popular options. You just said they've kind of caught up. Is there any reason you can articulate that you prefer GitLab to GitHub, or is just the inertia of that's where you've historically done your work?
So one thing that I don't think is available in GitHub are namespaces for the groups that you create for repositories, but maybe that's also different nowadays. Maybe somebody else can speak to that, but I know that in previous years, GitLab was the only provider where you could have groups and subgroups to organize your repositories. So for us, it would be like commercial, and then it's tooling, or it would be customers, and then the customer name, and then the project. So you have a nice URL. It's a nice way to browse your repositories. And I'm not sure if GitHub offers the same thing nowadays. That would be a reason for me to go with GitLab. I would miss that. Personally, I prefer the way that the issue tracking system is built up. But again, this has become quite similar in recent years. We do not use the wiki of GitLab, so I can't really speak to that. We have a separate wiki system, which is one of the most important tools that we have in our quiver, I guess. Because we need that for all sorts of documentation. We do a lot of open source stuff where we document these things as well. We have our way of working, our best practices. Everything is online in our wiki, publicly available, by the way. So I think GitLab and Git. We use Git fork actually for working with Git. I mentioned the wiki. I think that's important for us, and all the content that's inside. And in terms of tools, we use VMware to have our LabVIEW installations separated from each other. So usually it's one virtual machine per LabVIEW version. We only rarely have projects where we have a very specific set of drivers that we need to have. So then we can spin up a VM for that project, but usually it's one LabVIEW version, one VM per LabVIEW version. And we do have our CI system running. So our build servers, those are also virtual machines running on a server in the office. And
okay,
I think that's it, more or less.
And I have other questions, but I guess just Casey, what source code control tools are you using?
Pretty similar to your there. We're using Git as well. I was using Git before. Also GitLab And I think to your question of why GitLab versus GitHub, I think I was previously using Bitbucket, Atlassian's Bitbucket, and switched to GitLab. This information could be wildly out of date, but at the time, Bitbucket imposed some limits on how many collaborators you could have before you needed to start paying. And so being a smaller company, we were more sensitive to price. And so GitLab did not have that restriction. And then versus GitHub, again, this might be out of date, but the emphasis on GitHub is I think more collaboration and public repos and all that stuff, which is fine. It's great. I use GitHub for certain projects, but a lot of the stuff that we were using it for was client-based work, which was needed to be private. And the way that the options that I looked at the time, GitLab made more sense. As far as interacting with Git, I also use Git fork. I had previously used SourceTree. We're talking about the graphical clients here, and I will on occasion, mainly for batch stuff, use the command line. But my preferred way of interacting with the Git servers and Git itself is Git fork.
Okay, Sam, bring us home? Are you also a Git and Git fork guy?
Yeah. So yeah, I use Git. I end up using Git Bash pretty much exclusively. I think the GUIs are all good. If you're doing something complicated or you run into problems, it's often hard to fix it with the GUI. There is a website called, there is a safe for work version, not safe for work version. I think the safe for work version is Oh Dang Get or something, Oh Dang It. There's also one that's got some swear words in there. And if you look up, that has a bunch of like, I did this, I don't know how to undo it. And it has command line stuff. So part of the issue with Git is if you go look for help, there's so many different GUIs that the help almost always reverts back to here are the command line things to do what you want to do. So I think there is value in learning the command line in your day-to-day stuff. If the GUI makes more sense, use the GUI. Like I'm not mad about using the GUI. There are things that are definitely easier in the GUI. It's easier to see more context at one time because it can display all kinds of stuff in the command line. You don't get that display. Casey, you have something to add to that before I keep going?
Well, for the uninitiated, just to be clear, when you talk about Git Bash, that's the command line interface to the Git server. That's kind of agnostic of whatever client you're using, right?
Well, actually, command line to your local. So Git is a program that runs on the command line on your program, and it's kind of weird. It's also like the protocol for communicating with the server, right? So if you have the command line, you're interacting with your local server, you can also interact with the remote server, and same thing with the GUIs. So Git is like this distributed thing. So if you come from the SVN,
so if you're using a client, a graphical client, you already have Git Bash installed because it's what it's using under the hood for communication.
Yeah, usually. Sometimes it like has its own like binaries built in, and you don't install the command line tool. But that's kind of.
I guess technically Git Bash is another client, but it is a command line client.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so the big differentiation for people who are coming from an SVN world, in SVN you had the repository on the server, and that was it, and you were interacting with the command line or Tortoise SVN locally.
Yep.
You have a copy of the repository locally, and there's basically two copies of the repository. You have a local one, and then you have the one on the server, and you try to keep them in sync, kind of thing.
I grew up with Subversion. I feel so comfortable with Subversion, but I'm getting used to Git. Anyway.
Yeah.
Casey. Go ahead, Sam. Finish your thought.
Yeah.
If he's got
I was going to say that I think one area where it might make a difference between which kind of client you use to interface with Git is the size of your team. Because I think Sam, you do a lot of like individual development, right? And so we do that as well. But I mean, oftentimes when we're working with larger teams and you have a lot of parallel development going on, it's easier to see, I think, in a client like Git fork or SourceTree, the branches and where your progress is relative to those and how those might be interacting, or if there's a long-lived branch that might need to be merged in or something like that versus something shorter. Just are you behind where you can always do a pull or a fetch to see where you are, but you can kind of just see it immediately. I feel like I get more information out of a graphical Git client more quickly.
So I got two comments. One, Casey's 100% right in that it displays more information immediately. When you open it, you see all this information. When you open the command line, you just get the terminal window, and you have to know the commands to type in to see stuff. You said long-lived branch. Whatever you do, I highly encourage people to avoid long-lived branches as much as possible. if you have a branch that lives for like a month or two, you are probably going to end up throwing that code away. In my experience, because what happens
Because
is
merging it in is so hard.
diverge too much, and at some point you go to merge it in, and it's just such a pain. I know some people
Interesting.
might disagree with me. If your software is well designed enough, you might get away with that, but I still think you're playing with fire. Jorg, I still have more, but Jorg, you can interrupt me.
Of course, I love to interrupt you, especially to say that I am of a different opinion. No, I don't want to discuss long-lived branches for the 20th time with you, Sam, I guess. I think there are scenarios where it's okay to have something like that, but it's the exception to the rule, definitely. So
I will
basically, I
agree
agree with you. Yeah.
Yep.
Well,
I agree
I
on
just
that one.
wanted to add to what Casey said about the tool. I think for teams, it might make sense to have a graphical client because it is easier to start using Git with that one. So when you're bringing a whole team to Git and they haven't used it before, my experience is that when you have a graphical Git client, you show them the menu buttons, etc. And for the first step, that's good. Of course, ideally, they learn how Git works under the hood, and eventually maybe also venture onto the bash sometimes to fix stuff. But yeah, my feeling is that it's easier to get them started with the graphical client.
So one thing I will say is that the client, in my opinion, and I think that should be a personal choice. Like, I don't think everybody on your team has to use the same client. I do think there are some advantages if everybody uses the same client, because it's easier to support. If you're the team lead, somebody says, I don't know how to do this. If everybody's using the same client, you say, click on this button, and it's all the same on everybody's machine. So, but like, they're all interchangeable. So we can have one Git repository, and York can be using Git Bash, I can be using Fork, somebody else can be using Git Kraken, and they all work, and they're all interactive, and it's all fine. So
by the way, it'd be no fun if we all agreed with each other all the time. So like, I think the nuggets of wisdom come into where there's differences of opinion, and hopefully people listening can latch onto what is most reflective of their situation and what appeals to them.
Can I say one more quick thing about the graphical console? I think there's a parallel to LabVIEW, right? We're working with a graphical programming language that is not text-based. So I think it might be the case, or at least I feel like it is for me personally, but the graphical Git client lends itself to my way of thinking more than, say, just the text-based command line, right? So if people are used to programming in LabVIEW, that might be something that appeals to them. But whatever, I think we can all agree, whatever gets you using something source code controlled, if you're not, it's better than nothing, and you should do what works for you.
So I do want to shift into process and organization, but I have to ask on the tool topic before we leave it. One tool I didn't hear any of you mention that I'm actually kind of surprised I didn't hear mention of was VIPM. And my assumption is that in any given project, you're going to have logical boundaries of things that are developed asynchronously from the application they're consumed in. And obviously that's like, if you're pulling libraries off vipm.io, then that's exactly that. But presumably internally, you have components that you're doing that with as well. And so you wouldn't have those in the same repo as a specific customer project. So to what extent are you guys doing that? And are you actually using tools like VIPM to contain and manage the versions of those reuse libraries? Is that part of this topic in your opinion? Okay,
I can go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
I used to love to have as many dependencies as possible in the project repo. Not necessarily as native citizens of that repository, but when you like do the git fork or the pull, you have everything on disk and you can start it and it runs and it's fine. So that's easier than anything else, easier than having to deal with a packet manager. With that being said, with the nature of how LabVIEW is working under the hoods in terms of linking, it makes it difficult to like share some code that lives somewhere else and then has a dependency inside your repo, because which repo would it be then? Is it like customer A or customer B? So the more we started sharing our code as open source libraries, the more we ran into these troubles. And that's why we are currently bringing some of our like oldest reuse libraries into VI package format into VI-lib, which is a pain. We used to do it now for a long time for just standalone things. Like we have, I don't know, a MySQL driver, a PLC driver. These are just like, they don't have any other dependencies. So they make for a very nice VI package. You build the package, you push it to vipm.io, and that's fine. For the reuse code that's more specific to our company, we did not do that. But the more you want to share code, I think maybe specifically with how VIPM usage has also ramped up in the recent years, with all the investment that JKI made, for example, with VIPM.io. So all of that is going much smoother than it used to a few years ago. So it's becoming a much nicer way to package and share code. And it's becoming more and more of the de facto standard and what people expect, I guess, as opposed to like using submodules in Git, whatever that is, or like using source distributions that we use to build and export and namestamp, etc. So, yeah.
Okay. What about Sam and Casey? Is VIPM a part of your internal workflow?
Yeah, VIPM is basically the way I do reuse code. I mean, the other option, as Jorg mentioned, that I've heard people use is submodules, and submodules work, and I use them occasionally in specific instances, but generally
Some modules like an LV-lib or just some separate project?
Modules is a very specific Git thing where basically inside your main project repository, you would have a folder. And as far as Git's concerned, it just knows, go grab this URL at this version. And it just, when you do a clone or checkout, it grabs all that stuff and drops it there. It's
Eli,
a little but
Eli, you might know SVN externals.
Yeah.
And the Git submodule is basically the same thing in Git, more or less. So you're putting the content of one repo inside another repo. And I think the advantage to that is that you can push from your repo back to that container. So when you know that you'll be working on your library and you want to like push back from the customer project to your reuse library, which sometimes is handy, I think then submodules are like helping you. If you want to avoid or even forbid that, then maybe the opposite. Then probably not go with submodules, but rather do the VIP thing. So yeah, it depends on the use case again.
I think your use case, in my mind, the use case for submodules is I'm developing these two things in parallel and one uses the other, and I'm going to be changing both of them. Then submodules make a lot more sense than constantly having to issue VIPM packages.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to when you would use submodules versus VI packages. We also use VIPM. I find that we more often use it for developer tools than source code reuse. Because then what ends up happening is we have repos for our developer tools that we use during the development process. Those are published to VIPM. A lot of them are public, so that other people can use them as well. But a lot of times also we do a lot of work with PPLs. I know Darren is probably cringing out there because we want to reuse things and we want to have a lot of plugin architectures often that take advantage of that then. And I guess we could package it. This is kind of an evolving thing, right? You could distribute them using VI packages. You could use NI packages. That's another option to do it. Currently, what we started with was Git submodules, and we're still kind of using that. There may be better solutions out there. One of the issues I think can be challenging with VI packages and NI packages is that how do you make sure then that everybody is on the same package configuration, right? There's VIPCs which sync the different versions. But again, this speaks to if you're doing active development on both things, it becomes challenging sometimes to say, hey, is everyone on the team? And if there's a team of like maybe 15 developers, how come this is linked weird? Or how come I don't see this? Like, well, did you grab the latest package? Are we all in the same thing here? Versus if it's a submodule, you do a pull of a certain specific commit and branch, and then you get everything all at once.
So have you, I got to ask if you've explored the use of JKI's newest tool, Dragon, for that particular problem statement?
Not a ton lately. I've dabbled in it, but I'm waiting for the right project to kind of.
I think it's not a game changer yet, to be very honest.
Okay.
So Dragon promised that we would be able to install VI packages into a project repository, right? This is one of the things that are still currently being worked on. And I'm putting a little bit of pressure on Jim right now publicly. Sorry, Jim. This would really go a long way of making things nicer and lives easier, because then you could have like not a single registry on your computer, VI-lib, centrally stored, but you would have a VI-lib in your project repo. So you could store whatever package you want into your repository. And that would kind of take away a lot of the problem, I feel, that Casey just described, of having the wrong version installed, because you could switch between projects and each project would have the correct version, right? Because it's part of the repository then, more than of a central separate location.
But I mean, you end up using a lot of, I mean, I guess you're getting into duplicating those dependencies in separate folder locations across your hard drive, which hard
It's
drive space
exactly
is
what I
cheap.
want, really. So
That's okay. Okay.
yeah.
Well, and by the way, too, with the binary nature of the LabVIEW files, well, yeah, when you are using Git, to the point that was raised earlier, there's the server, but then it's basically storing a local instance of the repository on your hard drive as well. I mean, should people who are evaluating or just started to use Git have any special considerations regarding the size or concerns? No, Sam's shaking his head no.
I haven't run
Okay.
into, but I don't work on giant, huge projects. So I don't know if you have like million VIs, then maybe that's a problem. But for the size of small, medium projects, not even close to being a problem from my point of view.
Well, I would add here that you usually don't put your installers or other binaries like that into the repository that don't need to be like source code control version managed, right? So you wouldn't carry, you wouldn't drag that weight with you. But that's the only thing I would add to what Sam.
But you shouldn't do that anyway, even if you're doing text-based. Best practices not to do that. So,
you know, by the way, somebody mentioned it briefly earlier, but another tool I heard you guys explicitly say was the use of VMs. And I'm actually going to use that as a springboard to just get across a couple key points that I've been prompted to make throughout this discussion. So I think there are some specific investments that NI is making that directly align with some of the use cases and workflows. So I want to throw those out there and just get your reaction. You may be aware of some of them. Let's start with LV compare. It's noisy. It's been historically like useful, especially I've always said if the change is simple, like you just want to see, oh, somebody changed this constant value or added a case, right? It's usually pretty good about that. If you're comparing, 10 revisions later and trying to understand all the changes, it hits you with a lot of, I'll just use the word noise. So one of the things we're working on that's coming in a new version of LabVIEW that's releasing later this year is to make that report more useful, more consumable, get rid of a lot of the noise. So that's item one. Item two is that we're going to make it possible for the editor to be used to edit and manipulate older versions of your source. So you can have 2024 installed and be working on older versions. So you upgrading your code doesn't necessarily, or upgrading your development environment doesn't force your other team members to do the same. And then again, I want to get your reaction, but the third is something that's actually been out for a while, and that is the notion of the add-ons folder and the fact that you can store source VIs in a location that's then common and shared across multiple versions of LabVIEW on a given machine. And that's one we haven't talked too much about. I'm personally of the opinion we need to talk a little bit more about it. But any thoughts or reactions? Are you excited about some of those improvements? Is there more you want to see? What's the utility in the context of, again, team-based development of those advancements? I'll pick on. Go ahead, Jörg.
I always have something to say. You have to stop me, basically. I think the thing with the add-ons folder doesn't speak so loudly to me because we never have more than one LabVIEW version installed in a single Windows environment. Okay. So for that specific use case, I think we would not benefit much.
So you just rely heavily on VMs to solve that problem?
Yes. So yeah, that's it. For the being able to work on other LabVIEW versions than the one that the editor, like the one that you're opening, the one like the IDE, we like that a lot. We have been playing around with that, and it's not quite there yet, I think, because sometimes there are a few hiccups. But I mean, it's a beta feature, right? So that's all good, and it's very promising, and I think that will help a lot with making it easier to collaborate and to cross-collaborate. Not so much necessarily within a single team, because in my experience, usually like the team decides on a specific version, maybe it's even a license thing, so that's not so much of a problem. But when you're thinking about contributing to open source stuff or to these scenarios, there's much less cohesion in the team or in the infrastructure, if you will. So being able to just work on something in my LabVIEW 2024, and I don't really care about whether it's 20 or 18 or 21, that makes life much easier. So I'm really excited about that one.
I should get my facts straight, but I think it starts at 2020. So you can install 2024 and keep your source, or maybe
I thought 17 actually.
Yeah, I was
17. Actually, you're right. 17. I was testing you guys, and you passed the test. Congratulations. Sam, any thoughts on those investments similar to Yorg, or any
Yeah,
differences
well,
of opinion?
I do like the idea of the newer editor version, or being able to use the newer editor version on older code. That I think that's something that will help open source contributions a lot, because like a lot of times, like there are projects I want to contribute to, and the first thing I see is, oh, it's in LabVIEW 2014 or whatever it is, and it's like, man, I gotta go set up a VM just to do that, and that's a pain in the butt. I'm not entirely sure what it changes for like regular development, like production development, because you still have to have a virtual machine set up for CI to build it in the version that you want. And typically my workflow is when I get a new project in a different version, I set up the virtual machine for CI and I copy it, and that's my development machine. So they're both the same. And if you have like third-party driver dependencies and stuff, then you're going to want a separate VM anyway. So I'm not entirely sure how that utility works out there. I'm sure for some people, like the people, particularly like beginner developers or stuff, or people who aren't doing this every day, where they have like the version of LabVIEW installed on their laptop, I think that's a real game changer. For like the more professional software development people who are using VMs for anything anyway, I'm not sure I'm going to take advantage of that, except maybe to some open source code. Because like, I could see myself in the future having, LabVIEW installed directly on my computer in a newer version, and I can open stuff from older versions and do stuff if I want. So I think that's the use case that I see being most prevalent. I don't know.
Okay. So
I'm in a similar boat to these two, as far as I have a VM for each project. In fact, like maybe starting off with a different version of LabVIEW, but for each project. And so I don't immediately see a strong use case for me for the add-ons folder, or even the save in previous. I do agree with Sam that for open source stuff, I mean, we have toolkits that we manage at previous versions. It'd be nice to just have one IDE, and you can do that for the different toolkits. I'm curious to see whether these changes will eventually change my workflow, because this workflow, the VM thing, came to be because these things were traditionally challenging, right? With the way that LabVIEW was installed and everything like that. So if it changes enough, yet to be seen, right, where I don't have to spin up a new VM for every project or every version of LabVIEW, then maybe that simplifies that and it'll change things moving forward. But I don't know yet.
Okay.
But it sounds like on the surface of things, it just sounds like a convenience thing. But if you imagine that none of us have to run the VMs anymore, that would really be a huge difference overall once it works really well.
Well, and I'll assert, this, we're not done. I think NI has resolved to continue investing in facilitation of collaborative workflows and some of the tools like diff and merge improvements. But for the sake of time, let's transition and talk about process and architecture. And I guess my point here is we've spent a lot of time on the tools, and the tools are really important. But there's a phrase when it comes to working out: you can't out-train a bad diet. I'll try to apply this. It's like no amount of good tooling will fix poorly organized code or bad software architecture. So it's not nearly as catchy as the first phrase, but I think hopefully you understand the point. So I think there's a lot about how you structure your code and how you organize it. And let's start with some of the things that you guys do. So for example, are you using, or let me ask a more open question. How are you defining those logical boundaries so that you can enable your developers? Are they plugin architectures? Are they separate projects? Are they all working out of the same project? Like, what are some of the best practices when it comes to the structure and layout of your code that goes beyond tooling that you think is critical towards effective team-based development? And Casey, let's start with you.
Yeah, I guess I think I said early on that structuring your code goes a long way to how you use some of these tools and some of the problems you might be facing, right? So, and again, it kind of depends on the size of our team, at least for Zaya internally. I mentioned that we do a lot of work with PPLs because we want to have the option to do plugin architectures, and that lends itself well because we use Actor Framework for a lot of our projects. And if you want to switch to PPLs, you kind of got to back it all the way up. So our reuse libraries are just PPLs, and that sort of forces you to organize your code really well as far as dependencies are concerned, so that you don't have a lot of circular dependencies. So that's one thing that we're kind of forced into doing. We also make use of submodules in certain cases. Again, if we're doing development on two things that kind of play off of each other, perhaps, or it's more one uses something else, because you can't have a dependency you can't have a circular dependency there. So that's
so if I were to come into your team, if I was to start as a new employee at your company tomorrow and get thrown into a project, would I be given the entire project source code, like one project with everything for a given customer application, or would I be given a piece of it? And how do you structure just the project structure?
pretty generally, our reuse is a separate structure, like whether right now it's a submodule, again, it could be an NI package or VIPM or VI package, something like that. And then the code that you as maybe a different developer would be using would be specific to the project. And depending on the size of the project, it's either the entire repo, if it's a smaller project. If it's a much larger project, then maybe it's divided into submodules. And most often it's probably the whole project. And you'd be working off of a different branch. But there'd probably, if they were very experienced, we probably wouldn't have to sit with each other as much to define make sure that those things are not touching other branches. If it was a more junior developer, less experienced, we probably have some training there.
I guess, let me ask, is anybody here using like a factory pattern, for example, to dynamically load these components specifically with the purpose of like keeping that development flow separate from the calling application? Sam, you're nodding your head, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very common pattern. I know Casey uses that a lot. I know lots of clients use that. That's just really common. I mean, I think part of it is there's this thing, Conway's law, where like your architecture of your organization, like whether you're a bunch of small groups or whether it's one big collaborative group, kind of determines how your software gets structured. So I think there's some thought to be put into that. And I think there's also some thought into how you work together. And, you know, do you assign a bunch of parallel tasks to a bunch of developers, or do you work together as a team in sort of a mob or ensemble session or pair programming? I think there's a lot of value in those things, and I encourage people to go investigate those. I think monolithic projects present a lot of problems as they get larger. I think it's always fair to separate stuff into multiple projects. Even if you build a monolith, you can still have, here's a project that includes the classes that do this thing, and here's a project that includes the classes that do this thing, and then you have one big project that pulls it together using modules or however you want to do it. And I think that helps to isolate stuff as well. Even if you don't go the full route of like, I'm going to build PPLs or I'm going to build separate VIPM packages or however you do it. I don't know.
Just to make sure your point is understood, like it sounds like you actually have like a master project file that brings all the dependencies into memory. And that's probably what you use for like building your top level executable. But then components therein actually have their own project file so that people can work just within those.
Yeah, and you could have your own project file, and you could also have your own project file and repository. They're kind of like independent, right? So it could be in its own repository, or it could be in the same repository with its own project file. Like I've seen all those variations. My general tendency is if I'm creating a separate project file, I tend to want to create a separate repository. Like it's just kind of those two things.
That would be my instinct as well.
They don't have to be though, and I've seen plenty of places where they're not. As another example, I've seen people where like the unit testing tools, you can have like one project that has all your unit tests in to run all of them, and your main project might have a subset of them, so that you can run them from the project and not run everything to get quicker feedback if that's what you're looking for. So those are just
I mean, I think this is good. I think. Well, I guess any thoughts you want to add as far as the structure of your project tree and the notion? Do you have separate projects like Sam was just describing?
I would actually say that in my opinion, that's not the most important question to ask. I feel that it's more important to ask how teams collaborate. I think a common, a mutual way of working is the most important thing to have. And the other thing is that when we're talking about how do you structure, cascade your projects, etc., you're already thinking about a very advanced team when you think about the LabVIEW or the NI ecosystem, because I don't know, but I guess like 90% of LabVIEW users are in the beginners area. So it's much more important to agree on what is our style guide, what are our better practices, what are things that we don't compromise on, and it might be only a few things. How do we color our icons? Where do we store projects? Do we use Git? Do we use Git flow? We haven't talked about Git flow. That's a whole like discussion in itself. And I love Git flow. I know, I think I know Casey, you guys use it too. Sam, sometimes you like it, sometimes not. But I think it's so much more important to get these like soft things figured out before you think about whether you use the factory pattern or actor framework or DQMH.
Okay.
And that needs to be decided and figured out and discussed and defined, of course, but maybe not in the first, it wouldn't be the first question that I ask. Let's put it like that.
I almost feel like that stuff sort of falls out of the how you collaborate and how you communicate, right? It's not the driving force. It's kind of a result.
I love the word that you used, agree. I think it's a team-based decision. And I think like oftentimes where things go wrong is the team lead, the tech lead sees a great presentation on GetFlow or whatever, right? And I'm picking a GetFlow, but like, and then they come to the team and they say, we're going to use GetFlow because I saw this presentation. It's the greatest thing in the world and you're all going to have to learn it. And I use GetFlow, but that could be anything, right? Test-driven development, unit testing, whatever. And I think that's kind of doomed to failure if you do that because you're like forcing people to do something against their will. So like, you know, I think if you want to do that, a better way is, hey, how about we experiment and we try this thing for a while and see what you all think and then kind of go from there. But there is like a human element that we've kind of been ignoring all this discussion, right? We've been talking about technical tools and stuff. And I feel like the human side is also important to consider.
We are talking about tools, right? And there's that old adage, you got to pick the right tool for the right job, right? So we want to make sure that we're not forcing a tool where it doesn't make sense. We don't want everything to look like a nail just because we picked a hammer, right? So I think what Jörg is saying about the collaboration and the discussion is super important to deciding what tool and how you use it.
So in the spirit of enabling collaboration, I actually, you know what, I think for everybody listening, it sounds like there's a common interest in the use of GetFlow. Why is that such a popular tool? Can you speak to a little bit of how you're using it and why?
So
I don't know if Sam would agree with that statement.
To do that in 3 minutes, I guess, but GetFlow is one of the many available mental models on where you do what. Like if you picture your source code control and you have different branches, which Git allows you to do, then GitFlow gives you guidance on where to do what. You start your developments in a feature branch, you bring that back into a development branch. The develop branch is the one that usually contains software that is runnable, that is kind of good, but maybe not like thoroughly tested. When you want to create a release, you can do that in a release branch. So that would be a place where you can do more thorough testing. I don't know, maybe add to documentation, fix tiny little things that you find. And then you finish the release and you merge that back into your master branch. So that one contains only released versions. Also bring it back into your develop branch. So it kind of helps you figure out where and when do I do what. And you can add on top of that like branching nomenclature and other things that help you with that. So
we are running short on time. So in the interest of kind of putting your pen in some of the things, I think we covered a lot of ground. I learned a lot, and I have more questions than we clearly have time to get into. But at the end, I think we may have buried the lead, because I think you brought up some really interesting points around like tooling is really important, and it's where the dialogue often starts, at least in my experience. But I think how you organize the team and drive consensus on some of the most important practices was something I heard all of you guys unanimously agree is really critical. So I do want to drive that point home. I heard, just to harp on that point, I heard style guidelines mentioned. Are there other things that you would put into that bucket of things that are really important to get everybody aligned on around for the sake of enabling that productive team?
There's a topic, if you look it up, called team commitments. And I think you'll find a bunch of information on that. But I think like, just how do we work together? How do we conduct code reviews? How do we disagree? You know, when we have a meeting and two people disagree, what is the process for resolving that? I think those are really important things to get right that have nothing to do with technology. They're just general like team things.
And write them down, because then onboarding becomes so much easier if you have like all of that documented. And if it's a wiki, I feel like a wiki lends itself very well to that because it can live. So I think that's very important.
To your onboarding thing though, a lot of the people who talk about this team stuff talk about anytime you add or remove a person from your team dynamics change, and you should revisit those teaming agreements. So sit down with them and say, okay, this is how we were working before. We've got a new person. What needs to change? What should change? So yeah.
Sounds good.
Interesting. Guys, I really appreciate the time and perspective. We're right at the hour. So we'll stop it here. But I will say, I mean, I think even this topic alone, clearly there's a lot more that we could discuss. We didn't even get into CI and CD, I think, which is an extremely relevant extension of this particular topic. So good chance that we'll see that topic as one of the future topics for this panel discussion. So with that, I want to thank you guys for your time. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you all soon.